Basically, governments will be incentivized to keep the price of energy down. And this is a really bad policy. I'm going to explain why. Nobody is going to reduce their usage. We used to have large wealth-owning governments in the West, here in the UK, and now we don't. That means you used to own energy, now you don't. You used to own housing, now you don't. I, like most rich people, simply own loads of everything. There is only one answer for you that works, and that is tax.
There's a very seductive idea hiding inside this argument. It begins with something real. Energy gets scarce, prices rise, people get squeezed. So far, nothing controversial. But then comes the pivot. The claim is that the real problem isn't the shortage. It's ownership. Who owns the oil? Who owns the food? Who owns the assets? And if only ordinary people owned more of it, somehow the crisis would hurt less. It sounds sharp, almost profound. But it cheats, because it quietly removes the only part of the problem you don't get to negotiate with, the shortage itself. We've seen this repeatedly. During the 1973 oil crisis triggered by the OPEC embargo, oil supply to Western economies fell sharply, prices quadrupled. This was not a story about ownership concentration in the United States or Europe. It was a physical supply shock. Governments experimented with price controls and allocation schemes, but none eliminated the need for reduced consumption. Fuel shortages still occurred, queues formed, and economic contraction followed. This pattern is widely documented in historical accounts of the 1970s energy crisis, including reporting at the time and later analysis in outlets like The Economist. When there is less energy, less supply, fewer real resources. No system, no policy, no ownership model makes that painless. Someone still uses less, someone still pays more, someone still takes the hit. And this is where the argument begins to slip. It starts with a constraint and ends with a story. A story about who owns what, a story that feels morally satisfying, because it names winners and losers, but never quite explains the thing that actually matters: how scarce resources get allocated when reality tightens. Strip the argument down and it rests on three layers. First, a geopolitical shock. Energy supply falls, prices rise, everything becomes more expensive. Second, governments respond badly. They subsidize, borrow, suppress prices, trying to soften the blow while quietly shifting the cost. And third, the conclusion everything is driving toward. The real problem is ownership. Ordinary people don't own enough of the real economy. Energy, housing, commodities, capital. So when prices rise, they suffer, while those who own assets benefit. That's the thesis. Not just that crises hurt, but that they hurt because ownership is unequal. Now, there is something true in that. Ownership absolutely shapes who absorbs shocks. But here is the question the argument cannot avoid. Is ownership the mechanism, or just the outcome? Because if the mechanism is still limited supply, price signals, incentives and trade-offs, then changing ownership doesn't solve the problem, it just redistributes it. So we're going to test this argument properly, not by how it sounds, but by asking what must be true for it to work, and what happens when it collides with constraints that don't care what you prefer.
Governments will be pressured to cap energy prices, to subsidize energy, to reduce taxation of energy. Basically, governments will be incentivized to keep the price of energy down. And this is a really bad policy. I'm going to explain why.
Gary is right to focus on this. He's getting revved up because economically, this is one of his strongest points. If governments hold prices down during a shortage, they risk hiding the fact there's less energy available. Prices aren't just painful, they're information. They tell people to use less, switch behaviour or find alternatives. Remove that signal and the shortage doesn't disappear. It just gets moved somewhere else.
When prices are capped in situations like this, the way that works is you pay a lower cost and the extra price, the price that has gone up, is basically paid by the government. So even though you do not see the price going up, you are effectively, via your government, via your taxation, or via loss in your government's wealth, you are still paying the higher price. You don't pay it The government pays the extra, and that extra amount goes to basically the owners of the energy, the owners of the oil.
Gary is making a stronger point here than just subsidies distort prices. He's saying something more uncomfortable. He's saying, if oil becomes scarce and governments step in to pay part of the bill, the shortage doesn't disappear.
You are still paying the higher price.
The government just absorbs part of the cost, and because oil is still being sold at the higher global price, part of that public money ends up flowing to whoever owns the oil.
And that extra amount goes to basically the owners of the energy.
That's a serious point. But this is where I think the argument quietly jumps tracks. Because the fact owners receive higher prices doesn't explain the shortage. It explains who captures the value created by the shortage. And those are different questions. The first question is, who gets richer?
The owners of the oil.
The second is, how do we get more energy? Because right now, wow, we don't have enough. Those are not the same problem. Because high prices don't just transfer money, they also do something else. They create an incentive to find more supply. Oil that wasn't worth extracting at lower prices suddenly becomes economic. More expensive wells become viable. Exploration budgets increase. New projects get approved. Companies spend more searching, drilling and expanding because the potential return is now higher. At the same time, consumers start conserving and alternatives become more attractive. So the higher price isn't just rewarding existing owners, it's trying to pull forward the next barrel of oil and reduce demand at the same time. That doesn't mean the process feels fair. But the mechanism isn't owners get richer, therefore the system failed. The mechanism is that scarcity raises prices, and higher prices are trying to create the conditions for scarcity to stop existing. They encourage more drilling, more exploration, more investment, more substitutes, and more conservation. That's the part missing here. The higher price is not just a reward, it's also a signal. If oil owners never captured upside when scarcity appeared, why would anyone spend billions searching for supply in the first place? And this is where Gary's logic gets uncomfortable. Because if we tax away all the gains from scarcity, do we also compensate all the losses when oil collapses? Oil producers don't get guaranteed profits. When prices crash, projects fail, wells close, shareholders lose money, and investment disappears. You can absolutely argue for windfall taxes. Many countries do. But that's not the same thing as saying the profits themselves are irrational. The deeper question isn't, why are owners making money? It's, what incentive creates the next barrel? That's the question this argument never quite gets to.
If you simply try to keep the price down when there is less oil going around, it is going to cost you an enormous amount because nobody is going to reduce their usage.
Yes. This is the point where Gary stops talking about inequality and starts talking about incentives. And this is probably the strongest part of the entire video. He's now talking about mechanics, not morality. When energy becomes scarce, prices rise for a reason. Prices are not just numbers, they are signals. They tell millions of people at once, use less, switch alternatives, delay consumption, invest differently, suppress those prices, and you don't remove the problem, you obscure it.
If you simply try to keep the price down when there is less oil going around, it is going to cost you.
Demand stays artificially high, adjustment is delayed, and the cost reappears somewhere else. Government deficits, higher taxes, and future inflation. Often with a side effect, that being the producers still capture the upside. This dynamic played out clearly in Europe during the 2022 energy crisis. Governments such as Germany and France implemented large-scale energy subsidies and price caps to shield households from surging gas prices following the Russian supply shock. The International Monetary Fund and The Economist both noted that broad subsidies reduced incentives to conserve energy and significantly increased fiscal burdens, with Germany alone committing over 200 billion euros in support measures. At the same time, demand reduction targets became harder to achieve because price signals were partially muted. So far, the argument holds. For this to fully work, subsidies must suppress price signals, consumers must not adjust demand, governments must absorb large fiscal costs, and benefits must skew toward asset holders. In short, the policy must be broad, blunt, and poorly targeted. So here's where the argument overreaches. It assumes that all subsidies behave like the worst possible version. That is not analysis, that is selection. There is a difference between suppressing prices across the entire market and supporting households while allowing prices to rise. Targeted support preserves the signal. Prices still rise, consumption still adjusts, scarcity is still communicated, but the immediate shock is softened. The United Kingdom's 2022 to 2023 energy price guarantee initially capped prices broadly, but later shifted toward more targeted support through cost of living payments and energy bill assistance for lower income households. The Office for Budget Responsibility and Financial Times analysis noted that targeted payments preserved more of the price signal while reducing fiscal exposure compared to universal caps. Contemporary reporting, including Financial Times coverage and fiscal analysis, noted that targeted payments preserved more of the price signal while reducing overall cost exposure. That distinction disappears in the argument. Everything becomes government spends leads to distortion, leads to inequality. Sometimes true, not always true, and not inevitable. Escape routes. You could say, governments usually get this wrong. Perhaps. But that's a failure of execution, not of mechanism. Or you could also say, all support costs money. Of course it does, but cost alone is not failure. The real question is, does it allocate scarce resources better under constraint? That question is never answered. A real problem stretched into a universal failure.
The US has invested enormously in fracking, this method of extracting oil and gas, in the last 10, 20 years, and it has become the world's largest oil producer. So the US is by a long way now the largest producer of oil in the world. Is the cost of living going to go up for average Americans? Yes. Quite simply, yes. So I don't think having the energy in your backyard necessarily protects you if you don't own it yourself.
Gary is mostly right here, but I think there's a subtle jump happening underneath the surface. The US became the world's largest oil producer, largely through shale extraction and fracking, and yet average Americans still saw their cost of living rise, especially during the energy shock of 2022. Petrol became more expensive. Transport costs rose. Food costs increased. So yes, domestic production does not magically protect consumers from global prices, but that doesn't mean production didn't matter. That's the jump. Oil is largely globally priced, so Americans still felt higher prices, but domestic supply reduced something different: vulnerability. It reduced dependence on imports, reduced exposure to physical shortages, and gave the US more flexibility than economies that relied heavily on imported energy.
So I don't think having the energy in your backyard necessarily protects you if you don't own it yourself.
So I think Gary is right that ownership affects who captures the gains, but it doesn't follow that production stopped mattering. Higher production doesn't eliminate pain, it reduces the damage. Those are different claims.
Those energy production facilities in the US are not owned by the American government, and they are not owned by the American people in the large part. Ordinary American people do not own large parts of that oil production. That oil is owned by incredibly rich people who will dig up the oil during an energy price crisis, and they will sell it abroad to other incredibly rich people who will use it to fly their private jets.
Gary is making two arguments at once here, one economic, one moral. The economic argument is that scarcity creates windfall gains for owners. Fair enough. But then he jumps to private jets.
Rich people who will use it to fly their private jets.
And I think this is where the focus shifts. Because private jets feel outrageous. They're visible, they symbolise inequality, but they're also tiny compared with where most energy actually goes. Most energy isn't burned flying billionaires around. It's used in industry, freight, electricity generation, heating, agriculture, and ordinary transport. So even if you banned every private jet tomorrow, energy prices wouldn't suddenly collapse and the shortage wouldn't disappear. That doesn't mean Gary's concern about unequal adjustment isn't real, it is. His point is that wealthy people often feel less pressure to change behaviour. But if the objective is solving scarcity rather than expressing frustration, the question becomes, where does the energy actually go? Because solving shortages usually means changing millions of ordinary decisions, not removing a handful of symbolic ones.
Those energy production facilities in the US are not owned by the American government, and they are not owned by the American people
There is a real insight here. Energy is globally priced. Producers don't sell based on nationality. They sell based on return. So domestic production doesn't guarantee cheap energy. And if ownership is concentrated, gains flow upward. That's true. For the claim to hold, domestic supply must offer little protection. Global pricing must dominate completely. Gary is saying ownership must matter more than supply. In short, supply doesn't protect you. Ownership does.
They are not owned by the American people.
This is where it breaks, because supply still matters, always. Following the shale revolution Gary was alluding to earlier, domestic oil and gas production surged, making the US the world's largest producer. While Americans still faced high gasoline prices during global shocks, particularly in 2022, the US was significantly less exposed to physical shortages than Europe, which relied heavily on Russian imports. The ability to draw on domestic production and strategic reserves reduced the severity of supply disruptions. Domestic production changes, availability, resilience to disruption, dependence on imports, government capacity through taxes and reserves, and infrastructure and industry. Even in global markets, marginal supply affects outcomes. It doesn't eliminate high prices, but it reduces the damage. By contrast, Germany's reliance on imported Russian gas left it highly vulnerable when supply was cut. Despite being a wealthy industrial economy, the lack of domestic energy supply forced emergency measures, including rationing plans and rapid diversification. Ownership of assets within Germany did not prevent the shock. Physical supply constraints dominated outcomes. This vulnerability was widely reported during 2022, including in The Economist and similar publications. And this is where the argument slips. Ownership absolutely changes who benefits from the oil, but supply changes whether the oil exists in the first place. Those are not competing explanations. They operate at different layers. One decides who captures value. The other determines how much value there is to capture, and uses it to erase another. Supply matters. You cannot distribute what you do not produce. Prices are global. Yes, but global prices are shaped by supply. Profits go to the rich. Also true. But that's a distribution issue, not a supply argument. You can tax profits. You cannot tax energy into existence. It isolates one truth and ignores the rest.
Wealth distribution is about your ownership of resources, and if you want to be protected from the prices of resources going up, you need to have ownership of those resources. That is wealth distribution.
Gary is touching something real here. Ownership does matter. If you own oil assets and oil prices rise, you benefit instead of paying the full cost. If you own productive businesses, commodities or infrastructure, you're often more insulated from price shocks than someone relying purely on wages. That's true. But this is where I think the argument stretches too far. Ownership is one form of protection. It's not the only one. People protect themselves through higher incomes, skills, diversification, savings, fixed contracts, domestic production, insurance, government support, and simply consuming different amounts of scarce resources. And more importantly, ownership doesn't remove scarcity. If everyone owned equal shares of the oil companies tomorrow, the world would still have the same amount of oil. Prices would still rise. Consumption would still have to adjust. Ownership changes. Who receives the income from the shock? It doesn't eliminate the shock itself.
Basically, governments will be incentivized to keep the price of energy down. And this is a really bad policy. I'm going to explain why. When prices are capped in situations like this, the way that that works is you pay a lower cost, and the extra price, the price that has gone up, is basically paid by the government. So even though you do not see the price going up, you are effectively, via your government, via your taxation, or via loss in your government's wealth, you are still paying the higher price. You don't pay it, the government pays the extra, and that extra amount goes to basically the owners of the energy, the owners of the oil. We used to have large wealth-owning governments in the West, here in the UK, and now we don't. That means you used to own energy, now you don't. You used to own housing, now you don't. And when you don't own that wealth, you are fundamentally insecure.
Gary has now returned the argument back to ownership. we started talking about energy prices, then subsidies, then oil profits, then who owns the oil. And now we've arrived at something much bigger. The idea that the real source of insecurity isn't scarcity at all, it's ownership. That if ordinary people owned more of the economy, rising prices wouldn't hurt as much. And this is where I think we need to slow down, because there's a subtle shift happening. We've moved from asking, how do shortages get resolved, to asking, who benefits afterwards? Those are connected questions, but they are not the same question. Crises hurt because ordinary people don't own enough of the real economy. This is not trivial. Ownership shapes exposure. If you own assets that rise in price, you benefit. If you don't, you pay. Asset holders are insulated. Wage earners are exposed. That is real. For this to be the core explanation, ownership must dominate outcomes. Changing ownership must reduce harm. Ownership must mitigate the shortage and not just redistribute it. This is where the argument collapses, because ownership does not solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is simple. There is less to go around. This was evident in the 2008 global food price crisis. Food prices surged due to droughts, rising energy costs, and biofuel demand. Governments in multiple countries attempted redistribution policies, price controls, and export bans. Yet shortages and high prices persisted, and in some cases worsened due to reduced incentives to produce and trade. The World Bank and FAO both concluded that the crisis was fundamentally driven by supply constraints, not ownership structures. Post-crisis analysis by international institutions consistently pointed to supply constraints as the primary driver. If supply falls, total consumption must fall, total cost must rise. No ownership structure changes that. Private, public, collective. The constraint remains. Ownership determines who adjusts. It does not determine whether adjustment is required. Even in centrally planned systems, such as the Soviet Union in the late 20th century, state ownership did not eliminate shortages. Chronic shortages of consumer goods, food, and energy-related inputs persisted despite collective ownership, because production inefficiencies and supply constraints remained unresolved. Imagine the system implied. Everything is publicly owned. Energy belongs to everyone. Now a shock hits. Supply falls. What happens? You still face the same decisions. Raise prices, ration supply, prioritize sectors, subsidize selectively, or run deficits. Every option has a cost. Every option creates trade-offs. Every option creates winners and losers. Ownership doesn't remove the burden. It relocates it, from markets to politics. And politics does not eliminate constraints. It reallocates them. There is a hidden assumption. The argument depends on this. If ownership were different, the crisis would hurt less. That only works if governments allocate better than price systems, political incentives outperform market incentives, production and investment remain efficient. That case is never made. Now let's review some of Gary's escape routes. Inequality makes crises worse. True, but that's not the same claim. That's distribution, not mechanism. Ownership protects people. Individually, yes. System-wide, no. Because you cannot protect everyone from a real shortage at the same time. So in summary, ownership decides who takes the hit. The shortage decides that the hit happens.
We have created governments which are fundamentally, structurally dependent on saving their wealth, either selling their assets or accumulating massive amounts of debts to deal with crises. And that only works as long as you have assets to sell.
This is another moment where Gary starts with something real and then pushes it further than it naturally goes. Governments absolutely do respond to crises by borrowing. Sometimes they sell assets. Sometimes they avoid raising taxes because it's politically difficult. None of that is controversial. But then, the argument quietly shifts into something bigger. That governments become structurally dependent on selling assets and eventually run out of options. And I think that overstates it. Governments are not households. They don't survive by selling furniture until the cupboard is empty. Government capacity comes from many places: future tax revenue, borrowing credibility, economic output, regulation, investment and growth, not just ownership of assets. Public ownership can absolutely provide flexibility. Norway is probably the strongest example. Public ownership of energy created a sovereign wealth fund that increased resilience. But ownership didn't create the wealth on its own. Production did. Investment did. Decades of extracting and selling valuable resources did. And the reverse is also true. Selling assets can reduce future flexibility, but it doesn't automatically make governments poor or powerless. So I think Gary is mixing two ideas together here. Asset ownership affects who receives future income. State capacity determines what government can actually do. Those overlap, but they aren't the same thing.
They will deal with this crisis by reducing government wealth, which means eventually they will hit the same position that the UK is in now, where you have a serious crisis and basically there's nothing that your government can do to protect you.
This is where Gary turns a pressure into a dead end. Governments absolutely can weaken themselves over time. If you repeatedly borrow, sell income-producing assets and avoid difficult decisions, you reduce future flexibility. Fair point. But then Gary makes a much bigger claim. Eventually you end up in a serious crisis and there's basically nothing government can do. That sounds dramatic. Reality isn't that cooperative, because governments almost never run out of options completely. They run into harder and more painful options: raise taxes, borrow more, cut spending, inflate debt away, redirect investment, regulate, coordinate with central banks, delay the adjustment, spread the cost. None of those are free. But that's very different from saying there's nothing left. And I think this is where ownership quietly becomes the explanation for everything again. Because if government owns more assets, that might make adjustment easier. But it doesn't remove the need to adjust. Britain didn't become constrained because it sold assets. Britain became constrained because commitments, growth, productivity, debt, and political choices all interact together. Government ownership can buy time. It doesn't create unlimited capacity. So I think Gary is identifying something real. Governments can burn through flexibility, but then turning reduced room to manoeuvre into total helplessness. That's a much bigger claim. Gary's claim now becomes bigger than energy. Governments absorbed previous crises through borrowing and asset sales, and eventually leave themselves with less ability to respond to the next shock. There is a real constraint here. High debt plus rising rates equals reduced fiscal flexibility. Servicing debt becomes expensive. New spending becomes harder. That's real. So what must be true for this to work? Governments must be near hard limits. Borrowing must be severely constrained. And policy tools must be mostly exhausted. But this is where the argument starts treating reduced flexibility as if it means helplessness. Japan is uncomfortable for this argument. Despite carrying debt above 250% of GDP, the Japanese government continued responding through fiscal policy, monetary coordination, and borrowing. Constraints mattered. Helplessness didn't follow. Governments still have tools: reprioritizing spending, taxation, borrowing, regulation, monetary coordination, and targeted support. None are free, none are painless. But that's different from saying there's nothing left. This is where the argument turns pressure into paralysis. Less room to move is not the same thing as having nowhere to move.
It's important to recognise rich people, they don't really care how much their energy costs. They don't check the price of their energy before they decide how much heating to use. They don't really care the cost of their flights are. They are going to consume as much as they're going to consume, regardless of price.
Gary is pointing to something real here. Wealthier people usually feel price rises less. If your energy bill doubles and it's 1% of your income, you behave differently to someone where it's 20%. Economists call this lower price sensitivity. So Gary's direction is right. But I think he pushes it too far when he says, rich people basically consume regardless of price. That's probably not true. Rich people still respond to prices. Businesses respond, investors respond, airlines respond, even wealthy households respond. They just respond later and less aggressively because the cost matters less relative to their income. And this is important because the system doesn't actually require everyone to adjust equally. It only requires enough adjustment to happen overall. That adjustment can come from millions of ordinary households turning heating down slightly, businesses becoming more efficient, people changing transport patterns, factories reducing output, or new supply coming online. So I think Gary identifies something uncomfortable but real. Price rises don't affect everyone equally, but that's different from saying rich people don't react at all. The mechanism isn't equality. The mechanism is reducing total demand until it matches what's available. True, ownership provides insulation, but gains are by no way guaranteed. During the 2008 financial crisis, asset owners experienced massive losses across equities, housing, and financial instruments. Global stock markets fell sharply, major banks collapsed or required bailouts, and property values declined in many countries. Wealth concentration did not prevent losses, it exposed holders to them. Markets include losses, failures, destroyed capital, and price increases reflect scarcity, not a conspiracy. Ownership explains exposure to risk, not the cause of the shock. They benefit from price movement, not from causing it. Gary is pointing to something real here. Ownership provides insulation. If energy prices rise and you own productive assets, energy companies, commodities, infrastructure, or diversified investments, you often absorb the shock differently from someone relying entirely on wages. Fair enough. For this to explain the crisis, ownership must not only change who absorbs the shock, it must explain why the shock exists and why some people still have to reduce consumption. This is where I think the argument stretches, because richer people don't become protected because they stop responding to prices. They become protected because the cost is a smaller share of their income and assets. That's different. Wealth changes exposure, it doesn't remove scarcity. Even rich households eventually respond. Businesses respond, investors respond. Higher prices still push conservation, substitution, investment, and new supply. And if every household suddenly owned equal shares in oil companies tomorrow, there would still be the same amount of oil available. Consumption would still need to adjust. Ownership changes who receives the gains from scarcity. It doesn't eliminate scarcity itself. The shortage creates the adjustment. Ownership changes who feels it. Conclusion. The argument starts strong. It recognizes real scarcity, real price pressure, real inequality, but then it pivots from how resources are allocated to who owns them. And that shift does all the damage, because once resources are scarce, someone uses less, someone pays more, someone adjusts. Ownership changes who, it does not change whether. Across oil shocks, food crises, financial crashes, and modern energy disruptions, the pattern is consistent. When supply tightens, the adjustment cannot be avoided. Policies can delay it, redirect it, or redistribute it, but not eliminate it. You can redesign the system, you can redistribute income, you can change incentives, but you cannot negotiate with a shortage. And that is the part the argument cannot escape. So the final verdict is simple. Ownership decides who takes the hit. The shortage decides that the hit happens. If you've made it this far, you've probably noticed something. The strongest arguments usually don't start with something false. They start with something true, and then keep expanding until that one idea explains everything. That's what this channel is about. Not picking sides, not reacting to headlines, but stress testing ideas until you see where they hold up and where they break. If you want more of that, subscribe, because the next argument will sound just as convincing and probably fall apart in exactly the same way.